So this is based on my PhD. This is based on my PhD, but it's actually going to be published in an edited book by Callum Nicholson and Benoit Maya sometime in September, I think. And it's based on a case study of French stakeholders. I'll get into who in a minute. But basically, I was interested in understanding, once you step out of academia and you start talking to policymakers, NGOs, and so on, about the obstacles that they face to first talk about climate mobilities and second to act on climate mobilities. And more generally, the sort of persistent return, I think, that David Rather was talking about towards certain problematic narratives that have a really strong presence in debates even today, even though they have been critiqued for a really long time. There we go. So the first category of obstacles, I think, is one that will be quite familiar to you all, and they're very conceptual. So this is debates exactly like we were having earlier about, for example, between environmental and climate, migrant, refugee, displaced person, and so on. It takes the shape of first a proliferation of terms. So anybody who's not an academic and entering this field is confronted with a great diversity of terms. The second point, which I take from a paper from a decade ago, which is done at Sciences Po, is the categorical emptiness of those terms. I thought that was a very convincing thing. Basically, it means that a lot of them are used interchangeably in practice. People don't make necessarily technical distinctions between terms that we define much more precisely. They often don't have the time or the resources to work out all of those technical differences. The third is a lack of convincing representations. I'll talk about how a lot of the more alarmist representations are, I think, on the wane, actually, among people who have engaged with these debates. But once you take out all of those representations that are sort of problematic for their racist aspects, or the fact that they're suggesting mass migration, there's really a difficulty that these actors I was speaking to face in trying to identify convincing representations of who climate migrants might be. They have trouble identifying climate mobile people here and now that they can go and talk to or interact with or work with. The second thing, I think, is it becomes very important to pay attention to context, especially the national political policy context on migration. The first point here of the niche topic is simply that once you actually go out into administrations and NGOs, you very quickly realize that the portion of people who actually talk about climate mobilities is very small. It is not institutionalized. Most of my interviewees did not have climate migration as part of their job, like description. They approached it as 10% of whatever they were doing. It is often a side topic, and very few people had the money or the resources to make it their primary objective work. The second thing, which you can sort of summarize as governmental xenophobia, is the ensemble of regimes and policies that aim to reduce migration into Europe, which is very prominent in France, and really shapes and conditions all of the thinking. Really everyone I spoke to has this front of mind when talking about climate mobilities. And then there's a couple of more things, which is once you put yourself in that context, people who try to approach policymakers about this will encounter a couple of quite common reactions. The first is strategic ignorance, which is, I think, a really useful concept to understand that it's not always policymakers can often pretend that they do not understand or know, and they can use calls for more and better data as a way of sort of pushing decision-making back again and again. And this is something that a lot of migration scholars in France, especially like François Héran, for example, have pointed out, that there is indeed lots of available data and that the policymakers don't really need that much more to make decisions, but they use strategic ignorance. So this is the term I would apply to it. When you enter policy spaces where people actually have engaged with this, there's also something I've called sort of a conflict with ambiguity, which is this idea that all this proliferation of terms, this categorical emptiness is not something to be resolved, but something that people kind of keep alive, because it allows them to stay away from any commitment to new protections. And this is something that I encountered quite a lot. Going into sort of the more climate movement, environmental NGOs, in France at least, I found that they were less likely to speak about climate mobilities today than were migration NGOs, at least from 2019 to 2021 when I was doing my field research. The first reason is because they've kind of taken on board that you can't really make all these claims about mass migration. They try to avoid alarmism, but then that's then combined with a feeling that they don't really have the tools to speak confidently about migration policy, my second point here, and so they sort of shy away from it and often disengage from conversation. The migration actors that I spoke to really struggled to get climate movement and environmental NGOs to talk to them about this topic. And part of this, and this is one of the ones that I'm less certain about, but I often got this suggestion that there was a fear that if you started talking about migration policy in a more militant way, coming from the climate movement, that would lead to a loss of credibility among sort of policymakers, and that the very fragile power, if you would say, of the climate movement would be undermined by their attempts to bring in this strong social justice component that migration NGOs argue for. And so moving on to migration NGOs, a lot of them were split on whether or not and how to engage with the climate movement on this. And so this whole question of climate mobilities really became one of the institutional relationships. And I see I'm running out of time, so I'll just gloss over it a little bit. But basically, they were split almost halfway between people who believe that they really just shouldn't talk about climate mobilities at all because it was potentially discriminatory and would lead them inevitably back to alarmism. Migration NGOs were also, you know, they work in an environment where there are existing frameworks, legal frameworks. If they want to help a migrant who is currently working with them, there's no status for climate migrants. When working in that sort of emergency setting, that would be a common problem. I can talk about also that, you know, some of them prioritize things like freedom of movement over any other topic, but I'll skip that. And very briefly, when you talk to the international cooperation agencies, to NGOs with a more global focus, partnerships in the global south, a lot of them in sub-Saharan Africa, they often encountered a problem, which was that the people they worked with in communities wouldn't mention this necessarily. They'd focus on other things, you know, freedom of movement, inclusivity and decision-making and economic opportunity. And then the final point is that they would then also reject, as an extension of this idea that we even need to care about the cause of migration. If people are in need, then that's what we should focus on in practical terms, but also there's a moral obligation for that. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, David. I think there's time for one quick question. Keep it short, keep the answer short, then we move on. Kira?
Thank you. My name is Kira Finke. Thanks for the presentation. Did you also find out why all of these organizations would be interested to move forward on protection?
Any specific organizations or?
I mean, the slide now changed, but in any of these categories. So I think it's very fascinating what you sort of compiled there. But I would be very much interested how we could, as researchers, also bring some arguments why, yeah, let's say, for example, migration NGOs or these other actors you described could be interested in actually engaging in this topic more profoundly.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. Yeah, I gave you the pessimistic version of all this. I focused on the obstacles, and I think there is some truth to that. But there's definitely a place for, I think François-Germain was saying in the opener that, you know, there, as researchers, you can be entrepreneurial about this. I think what my point is that you have to be aware of these obstacles and that we are entering a field. I mean, there's this idea of stepping out of a research space into a political environment that operates by completely different logics, and that institutional alliances, you know, political and communication strategies play more even, you know, as much or more of a role than the knowledge itself. Like, it's not just about bringing in quality data; it's also about finding a way in which that data can be useful for people in that specific context. So, I mean, there's definitely a need I saw, and I was being solicited by my interviewees for advice on terminologies and so on. And I think there is definitely a space for researchers to help a lot of these organizations to like clarify their message, to understand their choices, their own choices about terminology. Yeah, I think, I'm not sure that answers your question quite enough, but we can talk about
Maybe
it.
that's also for the coffee table. Thanks a lot, David. Did we give an applause already? Don't remember.